Hello everyone, our topic today was requested by Noah Roten. We'll be going over the history of the Elves from the World of Warcraft franchise. Spoilers for the games and some books and such ahead. Les deux.
Okay, so first up, we need to do a little bit of world setup. And the Elves have been around for a long friggin' time. So we have a lot to go over. The world of the Warcraft games is called Azeroth. Azeroth is home to this thing called a world soul. A world soul is essentially the fetus of a titan. Titans are basically deific beings that are literally living worlds with ludicrous levels of power. In the WoW-verse, everything exists in equal opposition. Order, chaos, good, evil, etc. Two forces in particular are important today: the light and the shadow. The light is essentially the source of all life energy. The shadow, also known as the void, is essentially its opposite, an entropic force that feeds on life. Neither is inherently good or evil, and one cannot exist without the other. However, classically speaking, more nefarious forces are drawn to the void, and more benevolent forces are drawn to the light. Case in point, the Void Lords. Beings of chaos that wish to devour everything and that covet the immense power of the Titans. They want to corrupt them and use them to absorb, devour, and destroy everything in known creation. Thing is, they can't. Titans are too powerful for the Void Lords to mess with. So instead, the Void Lords want to find world souls and corrupt them before they become fully fledged Titans, allowing them to have a corrupted Titan once it grows up. To that end, they created the Old Gods to act as corrupting agents and just spit a bunch of them out there into space in hopes of having some of them find a world that holds a world soul, which is apparently a rare thing. A planet can exist and sustain life without possessing a world soul. This is actually why so many factions from the Great Beyond conspire to attack Azeroth time and again, expansion after expansion after expansion. Azeroth's soul is a rare and valuable commodity. Unusually so even, since apparently Azeroth's soul is abnormally powerful. Meaning once our dear baby soul grows into a proper Mother Azeroth, she'll be a boss even among godlike beings.
So eventually, a few old gods land on Azeroth and begin to literally dig into the planet's crust and establish chaotic Cthulhian dominion over basically the entire world, which is at this point a Pangea-like supercontinent called Kalimdor. For those familiar with the games, the current Kalimdor continent was named after this original big one. They happily do their thing for a while before the Titans, who are also roaming the stars in search of more baby Titans, show up to give them the boot and literally rip one of said old gods out of the planet like a tentacly weed. Which is when we're given one of the only acceptable excuses we've ever heard for locking the big bad things away instead of just blasting them into oblivion. See, ripping out and vaporizing that one old god left a massive gaping wound in the planet Azeroth. She was literally hemorrhaging arcane energy, which is apparently a Titan's lifeblood, and it was flooding everywhere. The Titans realized that if they pulled the rest of the old gods out, they would probably kill the baby planet god, so instead, they magically locked the remaining old gods up so that presumably they couldn't do any more harm. Then went about trying to heal the gaping wound in Azeroth's crust. The result was an enormous but stable pool of raw magical energy that became known as the Well of Eternity.
Why does all of this matter? Well, that well is the reason that any of the variety of elves even exist. Oh yeah, there are several flavors, and strap in, because that's not all. The elves actually began as friggin' trolls. Suck it, Tolkien fanatics, Blizzard did it backwards. The trolls are one of the oldest naturally occurring races on Azeroth. Orcs are aliens, dwarves and humans basically descended from golems. Yeah, Azeroth's weird. And as such also held sway over vast swaths of Kalimdor after the old gods were sealed away. One particular tribe of dark trolls eventually settled next to the Well of Eternity, and over time, the constant exposure to the raw magical power of the well mutated those trolls into the first Night Elves, also known as the Kal Dorai, or Children of the Stars, names they took from Titan inscriptions left in the vicinity of the well. As you might have guessed from the name, the Night Elves and the Dark Trolls before them were nocturnal. They also had a natural affinity for both arcane magic and the druidic magics of nature, thanks to their unique heritage. And initially, their civilization grew with a balance of the two powers. As the years passed, their culture thrived and they expanded, breaking the strength of the troll empires around them. Not out of lust for battle, but simply to secure their own safety. Part of their ability to do this stemmed from the fact that no other society had access to arcane magic. It stemmed directly from the Well of Eternity, and the Night Elves had sole access to the well, meaning they were essentially the only arcanists on the planet.
The well also granted them immense longevity, so fast forward a few thousand years, and a notable portion of the elven population had dedicated themselves to plumbing the well's secrets, and consequently the secrets of the arcane. They grew in power, knowledge, wealth, the whole deal. On the other hand, much of the population not centered directly around the well existed more harmoniously with nature. It was roughly during this time that big names like Malfurion, Illidan, Tyrande, and Azshara came into the picture. What no one realized was that all the manipulating of the well the elves were doing was sending mystical radar pings out into space and drawing the attention of the Burning Legion, a vast horde of demons that spent its time ravaging the cosmos like burning emerald locusts. Following the pings, the Legion found its way to Azeroth and contacted Azshara, Queen of the Night Elves, and convinced her that they could aid her in her desires to cleanse the world of so-called lesser races. Beguiled, she and her advisors worked to turn the well into a portal to allow the demons through. Things seemed sketchy almost immediately as the demons began pouring through and conquering everything in their path, elves included, but Azshara and her inner circle helped the demons widen the portal regardless. Malfurion, his brother Illidan, and his future wife Tyrande played major roles in combating Azshara and the Burning Legion, which leads us to the first of the elven offshoots. Xerios, one of Azshara's head advisors, fell in battle against Malfurion and was brought back by the demon lord leading the invasion as the very first satyr, and Xerios quickly spread his satyr curse to other willing demon followers.
As the war continued, our elven heroes secured the safety of Azeroth with a catastrophic victory. By blowing up the Well of Eternity, they collapsed the only access point the Burning Legion had to Azeroth. The results, however, led to the Sundering. The well detonated, shattering the supercontinent of Kalimdor into something resembling the continental structure we're familiar with today. In the place of the well now rages the Maelstrom. Yes, that giant continent-sized whirlpool in the middle of the map is a genuine, constantly roiling storm of death and destruction that pretty much everyone has avoided for the thousands of years since the Sundering occurred. On top of completely restructuring the landscape and killing untold numbers of creatures, the Sundering also directly led to two other offshoots of Elves. First, Queen Azshara and many of her loyal followers avoided drowning in the depths of the newly forged sea by forming a pact with one of the sealed old gods they encountered in the depths, becoming the Naga, amphibious lizard-like monster creatures that spent the next 10,000 years or so founding an undersea empire and plotting to free their old god overlord. You heard that right, the satyrs and the Naga both originated from the Night Elves, who originated from the Trolls. Yeah.
Second, as the Sundering ravaged the world in a literal flood of destruction, the mages of the Night Elven city Suramar erected a magical shield around their home that protected them from the devastation. However, the barrier was both mystically and visually opaque, preventing them from peering into the world beyond its borders. As such, the people of Suramar wrongfully believed that they were the only survivors of the Elven Empire, and that the rest of the world was being ravaged by demons. Thus, they spent the next 10,000 years or so locked away behind their magical walls, protected and nourished by the Night Well, a font of immense magical power they'd created to act as a substitute for the Well of Eternity, using powerful artifacts that had been stored in the city prior to the Sundering. The millennia spent under their protective dome and suffused with the energies of the Night Well eventually changed them into the Nightborn, also known as the Shal'dorei, the next subspecies of elf. Interestingly, we have translations of the elvish names for every other elvish subrace, but none has been provided for the Shal'dorei that we could find. Though based upon the other elven racial names, it can be assumed that the Shal'dorei translates to something along the lines of Children of the Night, or something like that, though that's entirely conjecture on our part. Unlike the Satyrs and the Naga, the Nightborn and the other offshoots we'll discuss during the rest of the video retained much more classically elvish features. Their skin color darkened, maintaining the various shades of purple of their Night Elven brethren, but in universally darker tones. As Suramar was a magocracy, magic was studied extensively and was common enough that even your average Nightborn children were trained in its use. Eventually, the Nightborn became so dependent upon the energies of the Nightwell, a theme for the elves, that they actually required it to survive, creating foodstuffs such as arcwine, which were literally suffused with the Nightwell's essence. As such, the ultimate punishment for the Nightborn was to be banished from Suramar, where they would literally wither away into mana-hungry zombies without access to the Nightwell.
The Nightborn would make it back to the world stage about 10,000 years after the Sundering, but before we get to that, let's take a look at what happened to the Night Elves in the Sundering's immediate aftermath. The surviving Night Elves made their way to the westernmost continent, which WoW-verse vets will recognize as the landmass that kept the name Kalimdor. There, they began to rebuild their society. However, because the use of arcane magic had drawn the Burning Legion to their world, and believing it to be a chaotic and thus dangerous brand of magic by default, the Night Elves outlawed the practice of arcane magic. Despite this, one elf, Illidan, created a Well of Eternity 2.0 using water from the old well. For this crime, he was locked away for the next several thousand years. A prison sentence that could only happen because a trio of powerful dragons stepped in to keep things safe by growing a magic tree over the new well. Thanks to the blessings of these dragons, the tree not only presumably masked the well from the senses of the Burning Legion, but also granted the Night Elves immortality and freedom from disease. With all of these factors in place, the Night Elves settled in to live at one with nature for most of the next 10,000 years or so.
Early on in that stint, however, many former arcanists among the Night Elves chafed at the illegality of practicing arcane magic. They believed not only that the rest of their brethren were overreacting, but that should the Burning Legion ever return, arcane magic would be instrumental in stopping them. Yet the Night Elves punished the practice of arcane magic with death. After a teen movie jock-style attempt at convincing the other elves that arcane magic was safe, useful, and etc., these arcanist elves were banished and sailed across the sea to the easternmost continents, which are collectively known as the Eastern Kingdoms. And there they eventually established the kingdom of Quel'Thalas. These elves eschewed just about everything about the old Night Elf culture that had cast them off. They created the Sunwell, essentially their version of the Well of Eternity, became diurnal rather than nocturnal, and began calling themselves the High Elves or Quel'Dorei, which means children of noble birth. By the fall of the original Night Elf Empire, nearly all nobility practiced arcane magic, and it was many of these elves that broke off and formed the High Elves in the first place, hence the names. To their credit, among the other accomplishments of the High Elves, they created a mystical border around the Sunwell with the intent of keeping its emanations from reaching out and arousing the interest of the Burning Legion, so they weren't just wantonly endangering the world to study arcane magic. Additionally, the combination of exposure to the Sunwell and the change to living their lives during the daylight hours eventually changed the High Elves' physical structure, turning their skin to more Caucasian or reddened tones instead of being purples and blues, and rendering them shorter and slighter than their Night Elf predecessors. They would later play a role in keeping the orcs from conquering Azeroth for the Burning Legion, fighting alongside the humans, dwarves, and gnomes to stem the tide of tainted horde warriors that fought at the demon's behest.
During that same time period, the Night Elves mostly chilled, largely unmolested by major enemies over on Kalimdor. For roughly 10,000 years, again, we use that number a lot because, well, they stopped doing stuff for 10,000 years in general, because that's when the games decided to begin. Until the Burning Legion assaulted Azeroth for a third time, which ultimately culminated in the defeat of the Burning Legion thanks to a coalition of Night Elves, humans, and orcs. But the defeat of the Legion came with a price: the destruction of the World Tree, the tree planted by the dragons over the second Well of Eternity. Which meant that, for the first time in thousands of years, the Night Elves were mortal. How's that for a cultural shock? In the aftermath, the Night Elves came down out of their mountains and discovered that arcane magic was being widely used by other races, that the second Well of Eternity was no longer its only source. The original well's detonation having seemingly infused the ability of arcane functionality into the world at large. Since that hadn't seemed to attract the Legion's attention, the Night Elves began cautiously allowing the practice of arcane magic amongst their ranks once more. Roughly around this time, the Night Elves planted a new magic tree in the hopes of regaining their immortality, against the advice of their greatest elders. As foretold, it didn't work. But on top of that, the tree became corrupted, thanks to Xerius, that original satyr, now turned nightmarish Dream Lord, initially causing many of the Night Elves' druids to be lost in a magical coma. But that was predominantly dealt with over time thanks to the efforts of many heroes. That's you, the players.
The High Elves went through a greater cultural shift, however. In the aftermath of the Legion's defeat, a horde of undead, led by the Death Knight and future Lich King Arthas, laid siege to the High Elves' capital and corrupted the Sunwell in order to revive a Lich companion of his. The city was eventually retaken thanks to the efforts of the only surviving royal, the High Elven Prince, and the Sunwell was destroyed, as it was determined that in its corrupted state it was actually killing the remaining elves instead of helping to sustain them. This series of events led to the death of roughly 90% of the High Elven population. As a way to honor their fallen brothers and sisters, the vast majority of their people accepted a cultural rebranding as the Blood Elves, or Sindorai, the Children of the Blood, a name which most of those watching this video will probably be more familiar with than High Elves.
After the destruction of the Sunwell, the Blood Elves learned something they hadn't realized about themselves. During their millennia of being literally bathed in the magical light of the Sunwell at all hours of the day, and before that, the Well of Eternity, they had become physically dependent upon the constant influx of arcane energy that the wells provided. Without it, many Blood Elves died from the withdrawal symptoms. It has been theorized that if necessary, the majority of the Blood Elves could have eventually gone cold turkey on arcane magic and survived. Most of those who died were fragile in some way, the very old, the very young, the sick, etc. However, their prince was concerned that without a source of magic, his people would become extinct. And so he made choices that ultimately led to his working with the Burning Legion, originally in hopes of saving his people. His efforts led to the Blood Elves learning to siphon arcane magic from living things around them, thus saving them from their hunger. However, if they indulged too frequently or deeply in this process, they risked devolving into the wretched, emaciated zombie-like elves, driven insane by their mishandling of their magical addiction, who wander aimlessly in search of more life from which they can drain arcane energy. The Blood Elf Prince, corrupted by his dalliances with the Burning Legion, returned home and used the Sunwell to summon one of the lords of the Burning Legion. Said demon lord and the prince were subsequently slain, and the shards from Anaru, think opposite of the Void Lords who spend their time fighting the Burning Legion, were placed into the Sunwell to help revitalize it, creating a Sunwell 2.0 that generated both arcane and holy magic. It's been intimated in the time since that many of the Blood Elves are somehow using the new well to help wean themselves of their magical addictions.
Which finally leads us to more recent events and the final offshoot of the Elven people. When the Burning Legion invaded Azeroth again, they found and muscled their way into the Nightborn city of Suramar, cowing and conniving their way into the city leader's good graces and using the Nightborn as fuel for their war machine. This is when we as a player base first encountered them. Those deals with demons led to a failed civil uprising within Suramar, which was eventually supplemented by help from both the Horde and Alliance, the two major factions which the player can choose between in WoW. Suramar's leaders, as well as Legion, were defeated, and in the aftermath the Nightborn rejoined the world, seemingly predominantly siding with the Horde and their sister race in both blood and ideology, the Blood Elves.
Sometime later, a group of magical scholars, predominantly Blood Elves, began researching the power of the Void for use in the fight against evil. Generally considered a bad idea, since the use of Void magics had a historical relationship to the very creatures of evil these scholars wished to face, and dipping too deeply into Void magic had been known to drive its practitioners mad. Like the Blood Elves before them, these scholars left their people to dig more deeply into their studies of the Void. Eventually, their studies led them to a world that had been seemingly consumed by the Void, and there they accidentally unleashed a powerful Void entity, which, with the help of Illyria Windrunner, they were able to defeat. However, the process permanently changed the scholars there assembled, granting them increased access to the powers of and susceptibility to the Void. becoming Void Elves, the Ren Dorai, Children of the Void. Ilaria was the first among their number, having achieved a similar transformation in a different manner prior to these events, and she acts as a leader and, alongside the being who taught her to control her newfound abilities, tutors the Void Elves, in the hopes of keeping them all from falling prey to the corruption of the Void. The Void Elves then joined the Alliance. Lastly, after thousands of years in waiting, Azshara made her move, breaching an opening to the surface world from her aquatic kingdom to launch an attack and reclaim the world for both her and her old god overlord. Ultimately, she was slain, though the leash on her master was loosened, if not outright broken, and her body was taken to his dark realms. So, for those counting, that's 3 to 6 varieties of elves depending upon how you want to count, all stemming from a single tribe of trolls way back in the dusty annals of time.
And that's basically the story of the Elves, an ancient race of beings involved in just about every major event on Azeroth, just by virtue of being there long enough. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like and maybe share it with someone you know might like it. If you have ideas for more videos you'd like to see us do in the future, do like Noah Row 10 and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more videos from us in the future, be they lore, let's play, or other, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.
In the meantime, this has been True Masters and Morons, signing off.
Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to see more like it, hit that subscribe orb.
To see our last Let's Play, click or tap the link on the right.
For our last lore video, click the link on the left.
Thank you to all of our patrons for making these videos possible.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.